The software you use to make the performance analysis is built by yourself, right? Right. I can bet many people would love to have access to it, like other content producers and maybe even game developers, to help them identify common issues. Out of curiosity, didn't you ever think about releasing it to the public somehow? It could become popular if open sourced. Even if paid, some people would possibly be willing to pay for it, and it could be an extra cash source for DF. So this is an interesting question, right, John? Because
Hmm.
obviously, I built these tools, and then you came along a few years later and started using them. And I think the bottom line is that it's not a one size, it's not a completely automated solution that's going to tell you everything you
No.
need to know about the frame rate of the game, right? So what do you make of this
So
question?
yeah, the big problem here is that it's not an automated process, and there's a lot that can go wrong. And every time you run a game through there, different games, because it's essentially reading just what comes out of the HDMI port, it has no sort of like internal connection to the game itself, right? And things can go wrong with that
Absolutely.
HDMI, including, some consoles with the dithered output. The PS3 is famous for this. Depending on how screen tearing manifests, there's so many different variables that can essentially cause bad data. And if you don't
Yep.
know, it's not, you can do an analysis, but maybe not notice that, oh, some of this data is bad, and just put it out there. It really takes a
Which has
careful,
happened a lot.
yeah, it takes a careful, not with us though. And that the
Well, yeah, I think that's basically it. I mean, we well, I started off doing frame rate analysis in like 2008 with really basic command line tools that would scan like an AVI file that you capture losslessly from the console, and it quickly became evident that you needed some way to do error checking. There's actually a
Yes.
video on the channel about how we analyze console performance, and it actually shows you the various tools we've got. And a lot of the effort in creating this tool wasn't so much about refining the algorithm, although that did happen. It was actually about being able to check and double check that the data is correct,
Right.
because a lot of things can happen. And there is actually an open source frame rate analysis tool called Teardrop or Teardrop, and I recommend you check that out. And it is the sort of tool that's used by a lot of people. And I guess it would be fine for like VSync games, assuming that you're giving it the right inputs. Quite a lot of
That's the
people actually
problem.
just were inputting like lossy data into it and getting false positives on performance drops, stuff like that. And yeah, basically, I think the the bottom line in answering this question is that the tool's only as good as the person operating it in a lot of scenarios. And you're quite right, John. There are some consoles that have like I mean, we'll put it this way. You've got an HDMI port. It's a digital output. So in
Right.
theory, if you have two frames that are the same, then the data should be identical from one frame to the next,
Right.
and therefore you can find a drop frame. But as we've seen, you mentioned the PS3, the PS5 actually does it in one of its
Yeah,
modes
one of
as
its
well,
modes.
where an identical frame isn't identical. And so, if you just blindly trusted the tool, every game would be running at 60 frames per second when that's
Yeah, yeah,
clearly not
yeah.
the case.
And I think that's the reason the tool shouldn't be made available, really, is that's the risk anyway, is that we wouldn't want a bunch of data appearing with our graphs and these tools that was
That's
wrong,
wrong.
because that
Yeah.
already happens a lot with teardrop, where I've seen tons of videos out there that just the results aren't correct, and it's just down to user error. It's not, I don't think it's intentional by any means. It's just, it's very easy to make those mistakes, especially when the errors are only minor, like it's like, oh, it's missing tears or something, or it's reporting false positives and that kind of stuff. So it's
Yeah.
tricky.
Hmm.
It's tricky.
I mean, I looked at Teardrop a couple of years ago and I noted that there was no way to actually check for errors. It was just input and output from what I remember. Maybe it's changed since then, but that's the reason we don't supply our tools, because, basically it's not a foolproof solution that bad data could get out, and we don't want our name associated with it, really.